The small community hall was always a lively place on weekends. It wasn't a fancy building, just a simple space with old wooden doors, faded paint on the walls, and a stage that had seen many local events over the years. That evening, the hall was full of people who came to enjoy a friendly talent night, something the community organized every few months. Families sat together, children ran around excitedly, and a group of teenagers gathered near the back, talking and laughing loudly. It was the kind of night where no one expected anything extraordinary. Everyone mostly showed up for fun, not perfection. The host, an older man with a warm smile and a slightly tired face, walked around greeting people. He loved these events because they brought the whole neighborhood together. On a small table near the stage, he placed a sign-up sheet for performers. Usually, people signed up for singing, poetry, a little dance, or maybe even a funny act. The environment was friendly, the atmosphere light, and no one feared judgment. It was just a simple evening meant for joy, as people talked and waited for the program to start. The door at the back opened quietly. A young man walked in, holding a small worn-out backpack. He wasn't dressed in anything special, just simple clothes. Clean but old, and shoes that looked like they had walked many miles. He kept his head slightly down as if he didn't want too much attention. Most people barely noticed him when he entered, but a few turned out of curiosity because he didn't look familiar. He wasn't someone the regular crowd recognized. He slowly searched for an empty seat near the side wall. When he found one, he sat carefully, like someone who didn't want to disturb anyone around him. He placed his bag on the floor and folded his hands in his lap. His eyes moved around the hall, taking in the decorations, the stage, and the people. Anyone who looked closely would see a little nervousness in his eyes. Something between fear and hope. The host noticed him while checking the list of names. He walked over with a polite smile and asked, "Are you here to watch the show?" The young man looked up and hesitated for a second. Then, with a quiet voice, he said, "I want to perform. If that's okay?" His voice was so soft that the host almost asked him to repeat it, but he caught the words just in time. "Oh," the host said, slightly surprised. Of course. The sign-up sheet is right there. Just write your name," he pointed to the table. The young man nodded and stood up carefully. His steps were small and hesitant, as if he was afraid every eye in the room was on him. Even though most people were busy chatting, he reached the table and picked up the pen. For a moment he paused. His hand hovered over the paper as if he wasn't sure if he should really write his name, or quietly step back and leave it empty. After a few seconds of silence, he took a breath and wrote it down. His handwriting looked gentle, almost shy, the way someone writes when they are scared of attention. A group of teenagers standing nearby saw him write his name. One of them whispered not too quietly, "Who's that?" "Never seen him before." Another shrugged and said, "Maybe he's doing a joke performance." They laughed lightly. Not in a cruel way, but with the thoughtlessness of young people who didn't understand. How heavy their words could feel to someone listening. The young man heard a little of their whispering, but he pretended not to notice. He walked back to his seat, sat down, and stared at the floor for a moment. He knew he wasn't someone people expected much from. He was quiet, new, and looked like he didn't have much. But he had come tonight for a reason. There was something inside him, something he had carried alone for a long time, and he hoped this night might give him a small chance to let it out. The host began the event with a cheerful welcome. People clapped, children cheered, and the first performer, a little girl, came up to sing a simple song. The audience enjoyed it, smiling and encouraging her. Then came a boy who told funny jokes. Some people laughed, some didn't, but they still clapped. After him, a couple performed a short dance routine. The hall was filled with the gentle, warm energy of a community enjoying itself. But every now and then, someone glanced at the quiet young man sitting alone. His presence created curiosity. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't look around much, and kept his hands gently folded on his lap. Some people wondered if he was too shy. Others wondered if he had signed up by mistake or out of impulse. A lady sitting near the stage whispered to her friend, "He looks nervous. I hope he's not doing something he'll regret." The old keyboard on the stage sat slightly to the side. It had been used for many years and was definitely not in perfect condition. The keys were slightly yellow, and some had faint cracks. Whenever someone played it, the sound wasn't smooth. It felt a bit tired, just like the hall itself. But no one minded because this wasn't a competition. It was just a place for amateurs to share their hobbies. A few performers later, the host picked up the list again. The next few names were familiar. People clapped as usual. Then the host read the next name, the name the quiet young man had written in for a moment. He paused. He looked up, trying to remember the face that matched the name. Then he found him sitting near the side. "You're up next," the host said with a friendly smile. Some people turned. The teenagers at the back exchanged surprised looks. One of them whispered, "He's really performing? Seriously?" Another laughed softly and said, "Maybe he'll do some funny act." Their laughter wasn't loud or mean, but it still floated through the air in a way. It could easily reach the ears of someone already anxious. The young man stood up slowly, holding the edge of his seat for a moment as if trying to steady himself. He wiped his hands on his clothes, not because they were dirty, but because they felt sweaty. His steps toward the stage were small and careful. He wasn't trying to attract attention. He was just trying not to fall or make a mistake before even reaching the keyboard. When he finally stepped on the stage, the room felt a little different. It wasn't silent, but something changed. Maybe people sensed his nervous energy. Maybe they were curious about what he would do. He didn't even look at the audience. He kept his eyes on the keyboard, took a slow breath, and pulled the bench a bit closer. "Do you need anything?" the host asked kindly. The young man shook his head. "No." "Thank you," he said softly. He sat down, placed his fingers on the keys, and hesitated. For a brief moment, the hall was filled with small whispers. People wondered again if this was some kind of prank. A couple of people gave polite, encouraging smiles. Thinking he was probably a beginner who would play a few simple notes, he closed his eyes for a second. It was a small gesture, but it looked like someone gathering courage, someone whispering something to themselves silently. The room around him faded away for that moment. The people, the whispers, the doubts, they all disappeared behind the soft darkness of his closed eyelids. He opened his eyes again. His fingers pressed the first key. The sound that came out was soft, almost fragile, but surprisingly clear. For a moment, it didn't feel like the sound was coming from the old keyboard on stage. It had a softness that made a few people sit up straighter. No one expected that kind of tone from that instrument, or from someone who looked so unsure. He played the second note, then the third. His hands moved slowly at first, as if testing the keys, adjusting to the uneven feel of the old instrument. But within a few seconds, something changed. His shoulders relaxed. His fingers started gliding more smoothly. The music began forming a gentle pattern, something delicate and emotional. The whispers in the hall quieted down. People looked at him, their faces changing from mild curiosity to genuine attention. Even the teenagers at the back stopped joking and leaned forward slightly. The host, who stood near the stage, raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had not expected this. No one had. On stage, the young man didn't look nervous anymore. Once his hands found the rhythm, he looked like he belonged there. His body relaxed, his posture straightened, and his fingers danced lightly across the keys, touching them with a kind of respect and care that made the music feel alive. He played as if he wasn't in a small hall, as if he wasn't surrounded by strangers, as if he wasn't someone people doubted moments ago. He played like someone who had carried music quietly inside him for years. As the melody began to grow stronger, silence spread across the room, not an empty silence, but a heavy, full one. The kind that happens when people are completely drawn in. When their hearts feel something they didn't expect to feel. The young man didn't look up once. He didn't need to. The music spoke for him. And though the hall had been filled with laughter, talking, and light noise before, now there was nothing but the sound of his playing, steady, emotional, and unexpectedly powerful. It wasn't loud, but it carried a kind of honesty that touched something in people. Something small, but real. It was at that moment, when the soft notes filled the quiet air, that the crowd realized something important. The This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a mistake. The music had started, and everyone felt something shift inside them. For the first few seconds, people only listened out of curiosity. They didn't know what to expect from the quiet young man sitting behind the old keyboard. But soon, curiosity slowly changed into something else, something deeper. The gentle notes that flowed from the instrument carried a feeling that made the room grow still, as if everyone forgot they were in a noisy community hall. The host stepped aside and watched from a short distance. He had seen many performers over the years, children singing off-key, adults trying their best, and even a few who surprised him. But this was different. The sound coming from that worn-out keyboard didn't match the machine at all. It was like the keys suddenly came alive under the young man's touch. Every note felt intentional, careful, and full of emotion. Even though he hadn't said a single word, people sitting in the front row leaned in without realizing they were doing it. A man who had been chatting with his friend earlier slowly stopped talking and turned fully toward the stage, his eyebrows raised. Two young boys who had been playing with toy cars on the floor paused and looked up, unsure why the music made them feel something they couldn't explain. Even the teenagers at the back, who had been laughing before, now stood quietly. One of them nudged his friend lightly and whispered, "Wait, he can actually play." His friend didn't reply. He was too busy staring at the stage with a surprised expression. The young man continued playing, unaware of the shift happening in the room. His back was straight, his shoulders relaxed, and his eyes stayed focused on the keyboard. The way he moved made it clear he wasn't performing for applause. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He played like someone who was sharing a part of himself he had never shared before. Each note mixed with the next, forming a melody that sounded both fragile and strong at the same time. People started exchanging glances, not mocking, not doubtful, but stunned. A woman near the middle whispered to her husband, "Where did he learn that?" Her husband shook his head, unable to guess. Another person whispered, "I thought he was joking when he signed up." Someone else murmured, "This is unbelievable." A soft wave of realization slowly settled over the crowd. They had judged him too quickly. At first, people saw just a nervous stranger with simple clothes and quiet manners. No one imagined he could create something beautiful on a stage that barely fit 20 performers every few months. The music began to shift, becoming slightly faster but still smooth. His fingers moved with a confidence that didn't match his shy presence. The way his hands glided across the keyboard gave the feeling of someone who had spent hours alone practicing. Someone who learned not from books or teachers, but from pure determination and love for the sound. The host, still watching closely, crossed his arms and let out a slow breath. He whispered to the volunteer beside him, "This boy, he's something special." The volunteer, normally talkative, could only nod. Outside the hall, the evening had turned quiet. The sun had set, and a soft breeze blew through the cracks of the old windows. The sound of the keyboard filled the room in a way that made even the walls seem to listen. A few children sat on the floor near the stage, their eyes wide with surprise. One little girl, who had performed earlier, looked at him with admiration. She whispered to her mother, "I want to play like that one day." Her mother gently patted her head and smiled. The melody grew deeper. It carried a feeling of longing, like someone searching for something they had lost long ago. It wasn't a sad sound, but it wasn't cheerful either. It was the kind of music that made people feel something in their chest, even if they didn't know what it was. As the music continued, the young man's face softened. For the first time that evening, he didn't look nervous or unsure. He looked peaceful, safe, like he had stepped into a world only he understood. And he was letting the audience peek into it for a moment. People who had been whispering earlier now sat completely still. It wasn't because they were forced to be quiet. It was because they didn't want to interrupt what was happening. A few phones came out, but even those were lifted with respect, hands moving gently so the moment wouldn't be disturbed. The host glanced at the clock. It had only been a few minutes, but it felt like time had slowed down. He realized something. This wasn't just another performance on a casual community night. This was something people would remember long after the event ended. The young man shifted into another section of his piece, and the melody changed again. This time, it had a spark of hope in it, like a small light trying to push through darkness. The notes rose and fell softly, creating a rhythm that almost felt like breathing. The audience breathed with it, their hearts moving in the same slow pace as the music. A gentle hush covered the room, so thoroughly that people could hear the soft click of the old ceiling fan turning overhead. They could hear the shoes of a latecomer outside. The hall stopped moving as soon as the person stepped in and realized what they were hearing. The new arrival froze near the entrance, listening in awe. In the back row, an elderly man, who rarely spoke during community events, wiped the corner of his eye quietly. He wasn't the emotional type, but something about the music reminded him of a distant memory, a memory he hadn't thought about in many years. On stage, the young man's fingers moved faster now. The melody grew brighter, the room brighter with it. His expression changed from peaceful to passionate, though still gentle. It was clear he was giving the music everything he had kept hidden in his heart for a long time. Someone near the front whispered, "What's his story?" And that question spread silently across the room. People wondered about his life, his background, where he had learned to play like that. But no one dared to ask out loud or interrupt. The moment felt too delicate, too pure. A little boy sitting with his father tugged on his sleeve and whispered, "Baba, is he famous?" His father smiled and shook his head. "No, I don't think so." "Then how does he play like that?" The child whispered again. The father didn't have an answer, but he looked at the stage and thought, maybe this was someone life hadn't been kind to. Someone who had talent, but never had the chance to show it. Someone who practiced alone, with no one cheering for him. Someone who carried music in his heart, but no platform to share it. The young man continued playing. But he didn't seem aware of the attention he had captured. His world was the keys beneath his fingers and the sound rising from them. He didn't rush. He didn't try to show off. He played with honesty. That was what touched the audience the most. Not the difficulty of the piece, but the sincerity behind every note. Another shift happened in the melody. This time, it sounded like acceptance, soft, gentle acceptance. Like someone finally letting go of a long-held pain, not with sadness, but with understanding. People felt it. Even if they didn't know his story, they could feel something personal in the music. Something human. Something real. Minutes passed, though no one counted them. No one looked at their phones. No one checked the time. No one asked when the next performer was coming. The event wasn't about the schedule anymore. It was about this moment, this unexpected gift. The teenagers, who had doubted him earlier, now watched in silence. One of them whispered, "I shouldn't have laughed." His friend agreed with a nod. Toward the side of the hall, a group of adults sat with softened expressions. Their earlier judgments dissolved completely. Someone whispered, "I misjudged him. I thought he was just some random kid." Another added, "This is extraordinary." Even the volunteers who usually moved around handling sound or stage lights stood still. One said quietly, "I've never heard anything like this here." The young man began building toward the final part of his piece. The music grew richer, deeper, and more powerful. It carried a mix of emotion, years of silent practice, personal struggle, quiet dreams, loneliness, hope, everything layered together. The audience felt all of it without needing any words. He pressed the final few notes with incredible gentleness, allowing them to settle in the air like falling petals. The room remained frozen. People didn't move. They didn't clap immediately. They just breathed in the last echo of the melody, as if letting go of something precious. And then, slowly, applause began, soft at first, then louder, then thunderous. People stood up without even thinking. They weren't clapping only because the performance was good. They were clapping because they felt something they didn't expect to feel that night. They were clapping because they realized how wrong their judgment had been. They were clapping because someone who looked so quiet had just shaken. The entire room with nothing but a melody. The young man finally lifted his head. His expression held surprise, confusion, and a hint of fear, like he didn't expect anyone to react like this. He looked at the audience, unsure what to do. He hadn't played for applause. He hadn't played for attention. But now, every person in the hall was standing for him. The applause didn't stop. People kept clapping, their faces full of amazement, respect, and appreciation The young man stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly. He bowed his head not deeply, not dramatically, just a simple gesture of gratitude. Even that small gesture made the audience clap louder. The host walked up to him, unable to hide his astonishment. He opened his mouth to speak, but for a moment, even he had no words, because no one expected that the quiet stranger who walked in alone, the one people whispered about, the one they doubted, the one they thought might be a joke, would be the one to move the entire hall with a single piece of music. And the night was far from over. The applause felt endless. But it wasn't the loud clapping that touched the young man the most. It was the expressions on people's faces. Some looked amazed, some looked emotional, and some looked like they were seeing him for the first time. The young man stood quietly on stage, unsure of how to react. He wasn't used to attention. He wasn't used to being noticed at all. As the clapping continued, he slowly stepped back from the keyboard. His hands trembled a little, not from fear, but from the heavy mix of emotions swirling inside him. He had never played in front of such a large group. Most of his life, his audience had been a small room, cracked walls, and a window that let in a slice of sunlight. That was it. That was the world where he had taught himself to play. And now, suddenly, he was standing on a stage, with a hall full of people applauding him. The host finally managed to speak, though his voice carried a hint of disbelief. That was incredible, he said softly, still watching the young man as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. The audience clapped again in agreement. The young man lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the attention. He never wanted to stand out. He came that evening because he felt a quiet need inside him, a tiny push that told him to share his music just once. Even if people didn't understand it. When the applause finally faded a little, the host invited him to step forward. "Would you like to say something?" he asked. The young man hesitated. Speaking in front of people scared him more than playing ever did. He swallowed hard and whispered, "Thank you." His voice was so soft that only the people in the front row heard it clearly. But his sincerity traveled through the hall in a way words never could. After a few seconds of silence, the host gently guided him off the stage, reassuring him that he could sit and rest. The young man walked back to his seat, but this time, something had changed. People looked at him not with curiosity or confusion, but with warmth. A few nodded at him kindly as he passed by. Someone whispered, "Amazing performance." Someone else said, "He's gifted." When he reached his seat, he sat down slowly, almost in disbelief. His heartbeat was still racing. His hands were still warm from the keys, and his mind felt like it was floating somewhere far away. He had played many times in his life, but not like this, not in a space filled with so many people, and definitely not in a place where anyone truly listened. Across the hall, people were talking quietly among themselves. Every conversation had one thing in common: surprise. No one expected that level of music from someone they had never seen before. A woman who had been whispering earlier turned to her husband again, this time more softly. "I feel guilty for assuming things," she said. Her husband nodded, understanding. The teenagers at the back sat quietly, their earlier jokes forgotten. One of them whispered, "We were wrong about him," his friend said. "Yeah, we didn't even give him a chance." Their expressions were thoughtful, something rare for boys their age. The host called the next performer, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The energy in the room before the young man played had been light, casual, almost distracted. Now, everything felt more focused, more meaningful. The next performer, a young girl with a flute, stepped on stage nervously. She knew she couldn't match what had just happened, but she still tried her best. People clapped politely, but their minds were somewhere else. Most eyes kept drifting back to the quiet young man sitting by the wall, as if trying to understand the person behind that music. They wondered where he came from, who taught him, why he walked in alone, why he looked so unsure, and how someone who barely spoke could play like someone who had lived 1,000 emotions. The young man kept his eyes on the floor, though he could feel the attention. He didn't like being the center of a room, but he didn't regret playing. Even if the attention scared him, the music he shared felt like something he needed to let out, like a weight lifting gently from his heart. A few performances passed. Some people performed poetry. Some danced. A small group sang a cheerful song that brought smiles to a few faces. The atmosphere slowly became lighter again, but something in the room stayed changed. People were kinder, more attentive, more respectful than before. Near the end of the event, the host stepped back onto the stage to thank everyone. He looked around the hall and took a deep breath, still thinking about the performance earlier. He didn't usually single out individual performers, as talent nights were meant to be casual. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the young man that evening wasn't just another performer. He was something rare, something unexpected. Before the closing remarks, someone in the audience raised a hand. The host paused and nodded at the person. Yes, an older man stood up slowly. He had been sitting quietly throughout the evening, watching everything with calm eyes. He pointed toward the young man and said, "Excuse me, but may we ask him to play one more piece?" The hall became still again. The young man looked up, startled. He didn't expect anyone to ask for more. He thought his part was done. He wasn't ready to be on stage again. His heart thumped loudly in his chest. The host glanced at him and smiled gently. "Only if he wants to," he said. Every pair of eyes in the hall turned toward him. The young man froze for a moment. He didn't like pressure. He didn't want people expecting too much of him. But inside him, there was a small spark, a spark similar to the one that brought him there in the first place. Slowly, he stood up. The hall watched in silence as he walked back to the stage. His steps were as gentle as before, but the fear was different now. It wasn't fear of judgment. It was fear of disappointing people who had already shown him kindness. When he reached the keyboard, it didn't sit immediately. He touched the edge of the instrument lightly, as if greeting an old friend. He looked at his hands for a second, thinking deeply about what to play. He didn't plan for an encore. He had no prepared piece. But music never lived in preparation for him. It lived in instinct. He sat down, closed his eyes, and took a slow breath. The hall waited, not making a single sound. He placed his fingers on the keys, and he began to play again. This piece was different from the first. The melody was quieter, almost like a whisper. It carried the type of emotion one feels sitting alone at night, thinking about memories that never quite leave. The notes flowed gently, like water moving over stones, soft but full of life. People immediately felt the shift. The music wasn't showing talent or skill. It was showing truth as he played. His shoulders loosened and his breaths deepened. He wasn't just performing now. He was sharing something personal, something he had kept hidden for too long, something he never said out loud. People felt a warmth in their chest, like the kind that comes when someone tells you a story that comes from the heart. No one in the hall could say what the music meant. They could feel the honesty in it. A mother holding her child rocked gently to the rhythm. A young man in the back swallowed hard, surprised by the sudden emotion rising in his throat. A girl in the front row leaned closer to her mother and whispered, "Why does it sound like he's sad?" Her mother didn't have an answer, but she squeezed the girl's hand gently. The melody changed slowly, becoming brighter. It was as if the music rose from sadness into quiet strength, as if saying that life may be heavy, but hope still finds a way to breathe. The hall remained silent, listening with full hearts. Halfway through the piece, something unexpected happened. A single tear fell down the young man's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. His tears didn't break the music. They became part of it, flowing naturally with the notes. He didn't look at anyone. He wasn't even fully aware of the audience at that moment. He was somewhere inside his memories, inside his struggles, inside the quiet rooms where he taught himself to play, because there was no one else to guide him, and the audience felt it. They felt the weight he carried. They felt the loneliness he must have lived. They felt the depth of a heart that had learned music as a way of surviving life's silence. The piece continued, each note a step toward something peaceful. While playing the final section, his expression softened into calm acceptance. His fingers slowed. The melody softened until it felt like a soft breath. He ended the piece with a simple, delicate chord that faded into the air. Silence followed, a full, heavy emotional silence. People didn't clap at first. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't want to break the moment. The hall was full of people, yet for a few seconds, it felt like the world had stopped moving. Then someone stood and clapped, and then another and another. The applause rose again, but this time it was different. It wasn't loud just for excitement. It was full of emotion, full of gratitude, full of respect. The young man stood slowly. His head remained slightly bowed, partly from humility and partly because he didn't want people to see the tears still on his face. He stepped back from the keyboard and whispered, "Thank you," though no one could hear it clearly. When he left the stage, something new happened. People moved aside to create space for him to walk. They didn't want him to feel small or overlooked. They wanted him to feel seen, respected, and appreciated as he walked back to his seat. A man in the crowd whispered warmly, "You touched all of us tonight." Another person said softly, "You're special. Don't hide it." The young man didn't reply. He couldn't. His heart was too full. He sat down again, hands resting on his knees, eyes staring at the floor. Not because he was sad, but because he couldn't believe what had happened. All his life he lived quietly, unnoticed, invisible, and now suddenly, a room full of people had listened to him with their whole hearts. He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't know what would happen after tonight, but he knew one thing for sure. He had finally been heard, and the night was not finished yet. The moment the young man began his piece, something inside the hall shifted. People who had been whispering only minutes earlier suddenly leaned forward, unsure of how to react to what they were hearing. The soft beginning had already surprised them, but now the melody was changing. It was growing fuller, deeper, almost as if the keys were alive under his fingertips. Nobody had expected this. Not from a quiet boy who sat alone in the corner since the program started. Not from someone who walked in with simple clothes and a shy look. And definitely not from someone they thought had signed up as a joke. A woman in the second row, who had earlier laughed when he wrote his name on the list, now felt a strange ache in her chest as she listened. She didn't understand the music he was playing, not by name or style, but she understood the feeling it carried. It was like the sound of a hidden story, a story that had lived in someone's heart for too long. Every note was shaped with care, every movement looked natural, yet powerful. The way he sat, the way he breathed in between phrases, the way his shoulders loosened as the tune flowed, he seemed like someone who finally felt at home. Even the children who had been restless earlier were sitting without moving. Their eyes followed his hands with curiosity, as if trying to catch a secret. The hall, which had been full of chatter before, was now filled with the pure sound of his fingers touching the keys with surprising confidence. It didn't matter that the keyboard was old and worn out. The audience didn't even seem to notice that anymore. What they heard was something that didn't belong to that old instrument. The sound felt too big, too sincere, too rich for it. As he played the middle part of his piece, his posture changed. His shoulders slowly lifted, and his fingers moved faster across the keys. The soft mood transitioned to something more intense, something that made people sit straighter in their seats. The host, who had earlier hesitated to introduce him, now found himself standing still beside the stage, watching like everyone else. He had seen a lot of performers over the years at different community events, but none had surprised him like this. At first, he couldn't even understand how someone this skilled could have gone unnoticed for so long. Rows and rows of faces were now fixed on the young man. No one whispered anymore. No one joked. No one pretended not to care. There was something about the music that didn't let them look away. It was not loud or dramatic in a show-off kind of way. It was emotional in a quiet, honest way. It reached people without forcing itself on them. It touched them without asking permission. One man at the back, someone who came just to support a friend on stage, felt his throat tighten as a specific part of the melody unfolded. He had lost someone close not long ago, and something in the tune brought back memories he had buried. He didn't know this young man, didn't know anything about him, but at that moment, he felt like the music understood him better than words. Another person close to the wall, who had been scrolling through a phone during earlier performances, slowly lowered it. Without realizing it, their eyes stayed on the boy playing. The screen went dark in their hand, forgotten. The piece grew more emotional with each passing second. The young man leaned into the music, his expression soft but focused. Even though he looked calm, it was obvious he wasn't just playing the piano. He was pouring a part of himself into it. His fingers sometimes trembled slightly when the quiet parts came, as if the music was tied to something personal. No one in the audience knew his story, but they could feel the weight of it in the sound. For a moment, it felt as if everyone in the hall was breathing with him. When he pressed a strong chord, the audience seemed to hold their breath. When he moved into a soft run of notes, people exhaled slowly, shifting only when the music allowed them to. It was a strange connection, one that none of them expected. A connection brought by someone they had almost ignored. A woman sitting near the aisle placed her hand over her chest. She didn't know why the sound pulled her emotions like that. All she knew was that she hadn't felt something this real in a long time. The tune reminded her of quiet evenings she used to spend with her family years ago. Memories, she thought, had faded suddenly, returned with warmth in the middle rows. A young man who had earlier laughed at the shy performer now felt embarrassed. He didn't want anyone to see his face. He remembered how he nudged his friend and whispered something rude when the boy walked toward the sign-up table. Now, as he listened, he felt small. But he also felt grateful that he got to witness something like this. The old keyboard made slight crackling sounds here and there, its age showing, but even those small imperfections added something special. The young man didn't seem bothered by them. He continued with the same expression, eyes lowered, as if he wasn't playing for an audience, but for someone inside his heart. His hands moved with a mix of tenderness and certainty. He knew what he wanted the music to say. He let it speak through him. As the piece approached its emotional peak, his fingers began to move in patterns that seemed too difficult for someone self-taught. His touch was delicate one moment and full of strength the next. Every change felt intentional. People who had no knowledge of music still understood the story he was telling. They didn't know what it meant, but they felt it. A teenage girl sitting near the front held her breath when he hit a sudden shift in the melody. She had never seen someone play an instrument like that in real life. She had only watched videos online, but those never made her feel the way this performance did. She wished she could learn how to express herself like that. Someone near the stage wiped a tear away quickly, hoping no one noticed. But they weren't the only one. Across the hall, several people felt the unexpected sting of emotion. Even those who usually didn't react to music found themselves getting pulled into the moment. Meanwhile, the young man remained deeply focused, unaware of the effect he was having on people. All he felt was the music moving through him. He played as if he had been waiting for years to let it out. He didn't look up at the audience. He didn't smile. He didn't even seem nervous anymore. It was like the moment he touched the keys, the world outside disappeared. The hall, once filled with normal community noise, felt transformed. There was something peaceful about the atmosphere, something calming yet powerful. Even small outside sounds, like the wind brushing against the building, seemed to fade. It was as if the music had wrapped itself around everyone and held them gently in place. The intense sections slowly softened. His fingers slowed down, moving with a kind of careful sadness. The loud notes gave way to quiet, thoughtful ones. People leaned in even more, savoring every sound. The drop in intensity made the room feel even more emotional, like the music was whispering something close to the heart. A man near the corner looked down, thinking about the things he had been avoiding for a long time. Somehow, the music made him think about the choices he needed to change. It wasn't something he expected from a random performance at a small event. Another person felt reminded of their childhood home. Someone else thought about someone they missed. Everyone had a different story playing in their mind. Yet all of them were carried by the same tune as the young man approached the final stretch. His fingers began to dance across the keys again, but this time with a brighter tone. It wasn't loud, but it had a hopeful sound. The shift was so gentle that some people didn't notice it at first. The music that had been filled with emotion and weight was now rising, as if trying to lift everyone just a little higher. People sat straighter. Some wiped tears. Others simply closed their eyes for a few seconds, letting the sound wash over them. The young man placed more heart into the final section than the audience thought possible. It was like he was giving the last piece of himself to them through those final notes. Each sound carried warmth, and even though nobody knew the reason behind that warmth, they accepted it. The music grew softer and softer until it reached the last few notes. He played them with such care that they felt like a gentle goodbye. A goodbye to the heavy feelings. A goodbye to the doubts people had about him. A goodbye to whatever pain he carried within. Then he pressed the final note. It rang through the hall, not loud, not dramatic, just honest. It lingered in the air like a soft breath. And then there was silence. It wasn't the silence of confusion or boredom. It was the silence of people trying to understand what they had just experienced. A full minute passed before anyone remembered to move. The young man lifted his hands from the keys slowly, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't ready for the moment to end. He finally looked up, and what he saw shocked him. The entire room was on its feet. People stood with wide eyes, open mouths, and hands ready to clap. But they didn't clap instantly, not because they didn't want to, but because they were still trying to catch up to what they had just felt. Then someone finally brought their hands together. Another followed. Then another, and within seconds, the hall exploded with applause. It was louder than anything that had happened earlier that night. The sound bounced off the walls and filled the young man's ears. He blinked in surprise. His face looked uncertain, almost confused, like he didn't understand how the audience had gone from doubting him to cheering for him with everything they had. People weren't just clapping. Some were cheering, some calling out words of praise, some smiling with the kind of smile that comes only after being deeply moved by something real. The young man sat frozen for a moment, unsure how to react. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He wasn't used to being seen. He wasn't used to being appreciated by so many people at once. But then something gentle spread across his face, a small, shy smile. It wasn't a proud smile. It wasn't a confident smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally been understood. Even if only for a moment, the applause continued long after the final note ended, and for the first time that night, the audience wasn't thinking about who he was, where he came from, or why he looked so shy. All they knew was that they had witnessed something special, and none of them would forget the moment when they realized it wasn't a joke. Not once the music started. For a long moment after the applause started, the young man didn't move. He sat there with his hands resting lightly on his knees, staring at the crowd as if he wasn't sure whether what he was seeing was real. The noise in the hall was loud, but not the kind of loud that makes a person want to cover their ears. It was warm, full of appreciation, full of a feeling he wasn't used to. His cheeks turned slightly red, and he looked down as if trying to take in everything slowly, gently. At a pace his heart could handle, the host finally walked back onto the stage, clapping like everyone else. He looked almost proud, even though he had nothing to do with the young man's talent. Maybe he felt proud because he had witnessed something rare, something that didn't usually happen at simple local events. When he walked up to the microphone, he didn't even know what to say at first. He opened his mouth, paused, and laughed softly into the mic. "I think we all need a moment to breathe," he said with a shaky voice. The audience laughed. Not because the words were funny, but because they understood exactly what he meant. They were still recovering, too. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes, some were still clapping without realizing it, and others were trying to calm their racing heartbeat. No one expected that level of talent to walk into the hall that night. No one expected anything close to it. The host turned toward the young man. "Would you like to say a few words?" he asked gently. The young man froze. He hadn't expected that. He knew how to speak, of course he did, but speaking in front of so many people felt harder than playing the piano. Music didn't require him to explain anything. It didn't require him to show his face or tell stories or let people in. Music let him hide while still sharing something. Words made him feel exposed. Seeing him hesitate, the host softened his tone. "Just a few words. Anything you're comfortable with? No pressure." The young man stood up slowly, almost reluctantly, and walked to the microphone. His movements were calm, but his breathing wasn't. When he reached the mic, he didn't look at the audience right away. He looked at his hands, first hands that were still shaking slightly from the intensity of the performance. Then he lifted his head just enough to see the front row. "Thank you," he said softly. That one small word was enough to quiet the hall completely. The applause faded, and silence filled the room again, the good kind of silence, expectant, gentle, warm. I didn't think anyone would like it," he continued, struggling to push the words out. "Honestly, I didn't think anyone would even listen." Someone in the crowd whispered, "We did more than listen." But they didn't finish the sentence because they didn't want to interrupt. The young man took a slow breath, then continued. "I've never performed anywhere like this. I practiced at home, on an old keyboard that doesn't even sound right anymore, but it's all I have." People exchanged surprised looks. They had suspected he wasn't formally trained, but hearing it in his own voice made it hit differently. "I taught myself," he said in a voice that cracked a little. "I watched videos when I could. I tried to copy the sounds. I don't know the names of most things I play. I just play." The audience didn't move. They didn't blink. They listened the way people listen when they know every word matters. "I wasn't going to play tonight," he admitted. "I walked in here just to watch. But when I saw the sign-up sheet, I don't know why, I just wrote my name." He paused again and his shoulders dropped slightly, as though telling the truth took weight off him. "I didn't think anyone would take me seriously." Those words, simple and honest, hit the room harder than any loud music could. A woman in the second row lowered her eyes, embarrassed by how she had laughed earlier. A few people shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own doubts, but still. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for listening." He stepped back from the microphone quickly, almost as if he was scared to say more. The audience didn't clap right away. They stood there, absorbing everything he had said. Then, slowly, applause rose again, this time softer but deeper. The kind that meant more. The kind that wasn't about excitement anymore. It was about respect. The host stepped forward and put a hand over his heart. "You didn't just play," he said gently. "You moved everyone here tonight." The young man gave a shy nod, not knowing how to respond. He turned to leave the stage, but before he could step down, someone from the crowd spoke up. "Wait." The young man stopped. A person from the middle row raised a hand. "Where did you learn to play like that?" they asked. The room went quiet again. The young man hesitated before answering. "Home," he said softly. "I practiced at home every day. I didn't have lessons. I just wanted to learn. It made me feel safe." Those words touched people in a way they didn't expect. Safe. Music wasn't just a skill for him. It was a place to breathe. Before he could leave the stage, someone else stood up. An older man with glasses, wearing a jacket that made him look like someone important. He approached the stage slowly, and the crowd stepped aside for him without even being asked. When he reached the front, he looked at the young man with disbelief and respect mixed in his eyes. "Excuse me," the man said gently. "I teach music at the academy in the next town, and I have seen many students come and go. But what you showed here tonight, I haven't seen often." Whispers spread across the hall. Some people gasped softly. The academy was known in the area. Most people couldn't even dream of getting into it. The older man continued, "You play with emotion. That can't be taught. Technique can be taught, but heart cannot. You have both." The young man blinked, unsure what was happening. "If you want," the older man said, "I would like to offer you an opportunity. Lessons, guidance, support, maybe even a scholarship if you're willing to work. I don't see talent like this often, and I don't want it to go unnoticed." The hall filled with gasps and soft murmurs. The young man stood frozen, staring at the man as if he didn't understand the language he was speaking. "You want to teach me?" he asked quietly. "I would be honored to," the man replied. The young man looked down, his eyes shining just a little. He had practiced for years alone, never knowing if he was good enough, never knowing if the world would ever hear him. And now, someone who taught real musicians was offering him something he had never even imagined. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, his voice trembling. You can, the man said firmly. You absolutely can. The audience burst into applause again, but this time the sound carried hope. It wasn't just admiration, it was belief. People believed in him now. They saw him. They understood him. The young man stepped off the stage. People gathered around him, but they didn't crowd him in a pushy way. They approached with kindness, asking small questions, giving soft compliments, telling him how his music touched them. It felt strange to him, almost overwhelming, but not in a bad way. He wasn't used to attention, but he felt something gentle in the way people treated him now. A child tugged at his sleeve. I liked your music, the child said simply. The young man bent slightly to meet the child's eyes. Thank you, he said with a soft smile. I'm glad you did. The child nodded and ran back to their seat, leaving the young man with a warm feeling in his chest. He never imagined a child would listen so carefully to his playing. He thought it was only adults who liked piano music. But tonight proved him wrong. More people approached one by one. Some shared their emotions. Others simply thanked him. One woman said, You made me remember something I forgot. Another said, Your music made me feel less alone. Someone else said, Don't stop playing. Don't ever stop. Those words stayed with him.